But anyway, it's $30 a person. We'd like everybody to be vaccinated, and I'm gonna put this in the church bulletin too, so it's gonna be opened up church-wide. So if you're interested, get your reservation in early. And Gary is collecting, and if you don't see him, if he's out under a bush taking a nap or something, just give it to me and I'll pass it on. But anyway, you can email us, call us, or just see us directly and get us the information. We'd like to get you down on the list. No reservations after the end of April, so let us know as quickly as you can. Thanks a lot.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. I guess the best historians always take dry, dull history and they tell stories and they make it interesting. One of the best we ever had was John Hurt. So I'd like to dedicate this presentation today to John Hurt and hope that I'm a storyteller and not just a dry, dull historian. So we're going to talk today about General Montgomery Meigs. And there's his picture. He was Major General, May 13th, 1860 to January 2nd, 1892. And probably some of you have heard of him. You've heard his name, but you don't know anything about him. He was an extraordinary person. Here's some of the high praise that was given to him. This was from Hugh McCullough, Secretary of the Treasury. And he says, you can read it there, the war could not have been prosecuted by the government with the smallest hope of success had not the Union armies been properly provided and cared for by the Quartermaster's Department. Fortunately for the United States, there was the head of this department, M.C. Meigs. And we're going to see that that's exactly the truth. The Meigs family came from Dorset in England with the Puritan migration. And he was born in May 3rd, 1816 in Augusta, Georgia. His father had studied at Jefferson Medical School, and when he graduated, he thought Augusta, Georgia, the new capital of Georgia, would be a good place to set up his practice. But he and his wife were soon sickened by the practice of slavery in Georgia, and he and his family returned to Philadelphia when Montgomery Meigs was about 1 year old. It took until 2012 for the good folks down there in Augusta, Georgia, Southerners, to recognize this hero of the Union Army. And there's a picture of the ceremony they had when they dedicated a plaque at his birthplace. They said they moved to Philadelphia when he was 1 year old, and he and his brothers roamed around the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers, swimming, fishing, getting in trouble like kids always do. And his mother, Mary, recorded that he was a bossy young man. He observed everything that passed by. He was delighted to see different machines at work. He was also high-tempered and a bit of a bully. And this, of course, served him well later, as we'll see. He was accepted at West Point at age 16 in 1832, and he excelled at math, map making, and getting demerits. In spite of that, he graduated 5th in his class, and there was, I think, 36 in the class, 19 of whom served in the Civil War. He's the only one that any of you have ever heard of. There was another Major General Ledbetter in the Confederate Army, who was the commander of those troops that captured the Andrews Raiders in the Great Locomotive Chase. But all the rest of them you've never heard of. So he graduates from the Point, and he's assigned to the engineers, and he works in St. Louis under a guy you might have heard of, Robert E. Lee, of whom Meigs was very fond, and they worked to clear the navigation on the Mississippi River. From there, he moved on to building Fort Delaware, Dutch Island before in 1839 being assigned to Washington for the Atlantic Coast defense duties. There's a picture he drew in 1837 of St. Louis, and what he and Robert E. Lee did is they diverted the current of the river so that the current came through here and scoured out the waterfront of St. Louis so that more ships, larger ships could dock in St. Louis. There's a design he drew of Fort Delaware. There was an earlier version, and he was there to do a second version, and that was never built. The version that's there today was built after Meigs left, and it's the larger larger fort shown there. So he's down in Washington in 1839. He meets the woman he's going to marry, Louisa Rogers. She's about his same age, and they got married in 1841. And she's the daughter of Commodore John Rogers, a naval hero of the War of 1812. And they're a prominent Washington and Maryland family. They have a mansion on Lafayette Square across from the White House. Not only did this marriage ground Meigs, it gave him political and social ties that were very beneficial for the rest of his career. There were 4 children born in the first 5 years of their marriage. Here's his plot plan for Fort Wayne, which was in Detroit. He was there for 8 years. They designed and built this wall band style fortification. The family enjoyed the frontier lifestyle. Detroit was a wild west in those years. Maybe it still is. He was very upset that he missed the whole Mexican War because others in his class and his friends in the Army and everything, they were making careers fighting in Mexico, getting promoted over and over again. He's stuck in Detroit. There's a picture of his 4 kids in a pony cart in Detroit around 1849. And I have an arrow there on his son, John, who figures later in the story. It must be a pretty early photograph. It's really sharp. So he gets assigned to Washington, D.C., to the Corps of Engineer office. And he's given the task of building the Washington Aqueduct. And you've all heard stories about what a pestilential place Washington, D.C. was, with swamps and marshes and bad drainage so that there's sewage flowing in the streets and polluting the water table and everything. So finally, Congress gets around to building an aqueduct to bring water from the Potomac up by Great Falls. Secretary of War at the time is Jeff Davis, another guy you've probably heard of. And they're also building the Capitol, expanding it at this time under the architect Thomas U. Walter. I recall a couple of years ago I gave a talk on him. So the expansion of the Capitol is transferred to the War Department, and Jeff Davis assigns Meigs to the position of overseeing that. He's also given oversight on construction of a post office building. He now has to master the art of politics and bureaucracy because he's overseeing millions in spending and he's solving huge engineering problems at the same time. There's a map of the original Washington Aqueduct that was built by Meigs, and it's about 12 miles long, and it runs from Great Falls, northwest of Washington, and runs right down to Pennsylvania Avenue. It took a lot of prodding by President Fillmore to appropriate $5,000 to study the problem. And the head of the Army Engineers, Colonel Totten, chose Meigs to construct it. There's one of the challenges he had. He had to make the aqueduct go across one of the creeks down there. That's the Union or Cabin John Bridge, a picture in 1863. And for 40 years after that was built, it was the widest masonry arch bridge in the whole world. And there it still is today. Now it has a highway running underneath it, but it's still there. Built will last. There's a picture of the Capitol being built. He was doing this while he was overseeing the Washington Aqueduct. And he learns again to devise technical solutions and deal with contentious politicians. He got into arguments with the architect, Thomas Walter, over design features and could the dome, was there enough load-bearing columns and this sort of thing. And of course, Congress in those days, it's not much different than today. There was power trips and ego and acrimonious factionalism of all kind. The only difference from today is back then the government was actually running at a surplus. So these guys were nickel and diming each other over money that was already in the treasury. Today it's a little different. But he gets a lot of practice fighting with various politicians and getting people on his side and that sort of thing. One of the problems he had was he hired an Italian artist named Brevet, and he was hired to do all the decorative artwork inside the Capitol. And he took criticism from Congress, who believed he should have hired an American. This is what one of Brevet's halls looks like, the Senate reception corridor. If you've ever been in the Capitol, authorized visit to the Capitol, this is what you'll see in one of the corridors. And all that was done under Meigs. So in 1859, the new Secretary of War, a guy named Floyd, who was a Southerner, he sacks Meigs from the Capitol project. Why? Because Floyd had a dentist friend from Alexandria, Virginia, and the dentist bid on the contract for the heating system of the U.S. Capitol. And Meigs, being an engineer, I think he figured a dentist teeth puller isn't going to be the kind of guy to do the heating system. But he was a friend of Floyd's, and Floyd said, okay, either you hire this guy or you're out of here. And he's out of there. But he's still in charge of the $6 million aqueduct project. War, April 12th, 1861. The Rebs fire on Fort Sumter when President Lincoln tries to resupply the fort. Now we should pause here and compare the Union versus Confederacy at the start of the war. The northern states have 22 million people. The southern states have 9 million people, of whom only 5 million are white. Pretty poor odds. But of course, we all know that one Southerner can lick 10 Yankees, so it didn't matter to them. The Union Army at the beginning of 1861 has approximately 16,000 troops. 40% of the officers in the Union Army resign and go join the South. Very few of the enlisted men did that. Most enlisted men stayed to the North. But you can see you're growing from 16,000 to what? By the end of the war, over 2 million people had served in the Union Army. And at its peak, it was a little over 1 million. So you're going from 16,000 scattered all over the country to having to supply more than 1 million guys. Guess who does it? Captain Meigs comes to the rescue. First of all, since he's known in Washington, Secretary of State Seward picked Meigs to lead an expedition to occupy Fort Pickens, Pensacola, Florida. And he learns to cooperate with the Navy, and they land troops and supplies, and they raise the Confederate siege of Fort Pickens, and it remained in Union hands for the rest of the war. While he's doing this, Fort Sumter is being fired upon, And when he gets back to Washington, he's now come to the attention of President Lincoln, obviously, and most of the officials in Washington, D.C. are very pleased with his performance. So in June of 1861, he's appointed Quartermaster General after a guy named William Tecumseh Sherman, who had been a quartermaster in the U.S. Army. He turned it down because he wanted a war command. So Meigs takes over as Quartermaster General of the entire U.S. Army, and he's commissioned a Brigadier General.
Excuse me. Did he go from captain to brigadier general? Was it?
Just like that.
Yes. That's quite a move.
And some others did it, Custer and a few others later in the war. So one of the first problems he had is how do you supply 75,000 troops that Lincoln calls to service? Because the arsenals and the quartermaster depots didn't have that kind of equipment laying around. So the government starts buying all sorts of, let's call it crap, from whoever presents it at whatever price. And I'm sure one of the things you've heard about is shoddy cloth. I thought that just meant it wasn't, it was inexpensive and whatever. There actually was a cloth called shoddy. And what it was is, Laura will appreciate it. They'd sweep the floor at the mill where the cotton was being weaved, and they'd take the lint, much like dryer lint, and they'd mix it with glue and make new cloth.
Oh my.
And obviously, after this cloth got wet a few times, it started to fall apart. So the Union Army was getting uniforms made of shoddy, and it was terrible. They were also getting substandard shoes with cardboard soles painted black and all sorts of other things. So this cartoon shows these sleazy manufacturers selling these inferior goods to the corrupt government agents. So Meigs has to put a stop to that. He also has to deal with corruption in St. Louis, where at the arsenal there, General Fremont is, I don't know if he was lining his pockets, but he was lining the pockets of his friends. And for something you could buy for 40 cents in downtown St. Louis, he was paying 80 cents to the contractors. And of course, this led to an investigation in Congress, like it always does. And they acknowledged that he was right to fire Fremont and that he had made a remarkable effort to manage funds. There's just a picture of the federal arsenal during the Civil War in St. Louis. That was one of, I think it was about 30 depots that he established around the country. There already was one in Philadelphia called the Schuylkill Arsenal, but he vastly expanded their role and the role of these other new depots around the country. There's a picture of the Schuylkill Arsenal in circa 1860. It was on the east side of the river at Grays Ferry Avenue on Washington Street. There's a picture of, well, the Schuylkill Arsenal supplied most of the uniforms, at least in the east, for the Union Army. And there's a picture of an artillery sergeant's coat made at the Schuylkill Arsenal. The supply problems he had were that regulations, for instance, called for every soldier to receive 2 heavy blankets every 5 years. Well, Northern suppliers were used to supplying 16,000 troops, not 75,000 and then 250,000 and whatever. They couldn't provide for the demand. And also the seamstresses in the United States had fought against mechanization. In 1857, the first chain stitch sewing machine was introduced, but it wasn't in widespread use because the seamstresses were up in arms about it. So Meigs went and spent $800,000 to buy blankets and other supplies from French firms, and of course Congress wants to buy American even though it wasn't available, so he had to deal with complaints from Congress. By the height of the war, the Schuylkill Arsenal alone had 60,000 seamstresses employed making clothing.
Wow.
Incredible.
Yeah.
The other problem he saw immediately was that the Union Army was going to have to invade the South through the river system in the West. Tennessee, Cumberland, Mississippi, Yazoo, the Red River, whatever. So he saw a need for Union gunboats. So he contracted with a man named James Eads to build 7 city-class ironclads. They eventually cost $175,000 each, which was, of course, twice what the original estimate was. And they had 2.5-inch plate armor. Remarkably, they were launched within a couple of months. Try to do that today. So he worked with Commander Foote and General Grant worked together. They took 4 of them up the Tennessee River, and they captured Forts Henry and Donelson, the first big victory for the Union in the Civil War. And these 7 ironclads served successfully throughout the war. They weren't sunk. And the Union ended up building 76 monitor types and another 80 tinclads for use in brown and blue water. And this construction wasn't under the Navy, it was under Meigs. There's a picture of one of the ironclads, the USS Cairo. It was one of those that was sunk. I think 2 of the 7 were sunk. It was sunk by a mine near Vicksburg. They found it in 1956, buried in the mud on the riverbank. If you go to Vicksburg today, you can still see it. They cleared it out and they put a roof over it. It's quite the thing to see. It's pretty much intact. So the first major military campaign in the East for the Union Army was McClellan's move to the peninsula in the spring of '62. Meigs had to charter hundreds of steamers and other ships to move McClellan's 100,000 soldiers, 14,000 animals and supplies to equip and feed them all. By the end of the war, the Quartermaster Department leased 753 steamships, 1,100 sailing vessels, more than 800 barges, and 300 other vessels. Now, obviously, he didn't do this with just the 100 or 200 clerks that he had working in the Quartermaster office in Washington. He had to have good subordinates. Any great leader depends on a subordinate. So the Army of the Potomac, his logistics genius was a guy named General Rufus Ingalls. He served exceptionally in moving McClellan's supply base from Washington, or from White House Landing to Harrison's Landing in 1862, when McClellan had to retreat from Richmond area. And he served the Army of the Potomac right through the war till Grant besieged Petersburg. Now this is just a slide that shows you what the Army of the Potomac alone required: 600 tons of supplies every day. Every animal needed 14 pounds of hay and 12 pounds of oats, corn, or barley. So of those 600 tons every day, 400 tons was just for the animals. You know, you watch TV shows or movies or something, you always get the idea the animals just ate the grass as they went along. Well, grass is not that nutritious. These animals needed hay and oats and corn in order to maintain their strength, whether they were cavalry horses or wagon horses. Every soldier needed 3 pounds of food per day, plus the equipment and ordnance. Meigs was not in charge of procuring weapons, cannons, gunpowder, whatever, but he was in charge of moving it. He set up an office in New York City to buy all the animals for the entire Union Army. And he developed a system of horse inspectors because unscrupulous farmers and dealers were selling them old animals, broken down animals, animals with hoof problems, and that sort of thing. So for $185 each, he became the standard, and these horse inspectors made sure the Union Army had proper horses. Now, I couldn't find the statistics for the whole war, but one of the other vital items, 3,251 tons of whiskey and alcohol were moved by one railroad, the Pennsylvania Railroad, from Pittsburgh to Baltimore in 1861. So multiply that times 4 more years of the war and all the other railroads. The Union Army may have had a drinking problem. Meigs is also a champion of colored troops. Early in 1863, he called for enlisting and arming black men to fight to end slavery. Senator Wilson remarked that he was among the first men engaged in this war who declared it to be the true policy of the government to organize black men of the South for military purposes. We've all heard of the famous 54th Massachusetts, the movie Glory. Certainly showed them at their best. Their camp where they trained was named for General Meigs. What happened here?
No. Okay. That did great.
Usually, whatever army won a battle, they were responsible for cleaning up the battlefield before they moved on. But after the huge battle at Gettysburg, Meigs urged General Meade to get on with the pursuit of General Lee and leave the quartermaster to clean up the battlefield at Gettysburg. So the quartermaster department buried all the dead soldiers and animals. They arrested the looters, and they recovered about 24,000 rifles, 10,000 bayonets, and 2,400 cartridge boxes, all of which got recycled back into the action. So in that case, the quartermaster freed the army to pursue Lee, which, as we all know, was a bit of a fiasco, but at least they tried.
Is something
Thinking back to the Mexican War,
Dan had a question.
Dan?
Dan?
yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is interesting. Is something similar to that cleanup done today?
I don't know. I know in World War II they had graves registration men whose job was to go in and bury people, and I'm sure they had engineering battalions that would go in and pull out the old tanks and things like that. So
Is a battlefield so much different today? Is there? I'm just musing. What I know about battle, I know about surgery and a lot of other things. I don't know much about it, but is battle done differently today? So there's a different need. I'm just wondering.
I assume with the mechanization, it's a lot different. The headquarters is usually miles behind the battlefield, whereas at Gettysburg, Meade was so close, his headquarters was being shelled. They still have they have MASH hospitals now behind the lines. You had barns and things like that in those days. So that's an interesting thing. Maybe you can research it and present it to us.
I'll put it on my someday maybe list.
Okay.
Thank you.
So as I was saying, Meigs wanted to see action. He missed it in the Mexican War. So he traveled to Louisville in October of 1863 to consult with General Grant concerning General Thomas's army, which was trapped in Chattanooga. And he had a flat-bottom boat constructed to navigate the shallow Tennessee River so he could bring supplies to Bridgeport. And this opened what's called the Cracker Line, which sustained Thomas and eventually allowed Grant to attack the Rebs. And Meigs was present there to witness a successful attack at Missionary Ridge. There's a picture of the boat. It was built pretty quickly, and it opened the cracker line, and the Union Army in Chattanooga had been slowly starving to death, and this supplied. There's a picture of the commanders watching the Union assault on Missionary Ridge. I don't know if Meigs is in that picture, but very successful and surprising results in that battle. So we moved towards the end of the war, and Grant comes east in March or April of March of 1864, and they developed the Overland Campaign. And this is a picture of just a small portion of the 4,300 wagons that were assembled for Grant's advancement on Richmond. Tell you, the Confederates had nothing like this. All they had was Robert E. Lee and courage. And there's the supply wagons for the campaign in Georgia that Sherman launched. You'll remember this was a coordinated campaign where Grant wanted all the armies of the United States to advance at the same time. Now, to keep wagons rolling during the war, the Union Army used 114,000 horses, 88,000 mules, and some of them were used for the 126 cavalry regiments. But mules were better for moving wagons, and they actually had schools for mules. One of them was down there in Perryville, Maryland, on the Susquehanna River, and there's a picture of the historical plaque that sits there. And they actually trained these mules to pull wagons without being stubborn. Now we come to
My wife wants to send me there.
I think it's closed.
Oh,
Maybe a dog obedience school or something. So his son was Brevet Major John R. Meigs, born in 1842, and he was killed in action at Swift Run, Virginia. He went to the academy at West Point, and he was first in his class. Graduated in June 1863, and he too was a hothead. There's one story where he and another cadet were there at the parade, on the parade ground at West Point, and somebody insulted somebody, and a fist fight started. And Meigs and the other cadet beat each other so badly that both of them ended up in the hospital for like a week. Now, normally that would have caused his dismissal from the academy, but the Union Army needed trained officers at the time, so it was overlooked, and he managed to graduate #1 in his class. And he was immediately assigned as an engineering aide-de-camp to General Sheridan. Sheridan is out fending off General Early in the Shenandoah Valley, and Meigs is out there drawing maps, and it's a rainy night, and he and two companions ride up to three men on horses, and they all have their black rain slickers on, so they can't really tell which army they're with. The shot rings out, Meigs drops dead. And General Meigs offered $1,000 reward, and it turns out these were some of John Mosby's irregular Confederates. And Sheridan burned the town of Dayton, Virginia in retaliation. Historians still don't know exactly what happened. Some say that this hothead, John Meigs, pulled his pistol, fired, and they shot him dead. Others, one of the men who survived on his group said that he raised his hands and they shot him when he was surrendering. So we still don't know, but the son died in action. So Grant moves on down to the Richmond, Petersburg area, And they established the largest port in the United States. City Point is supplied by 190 steamers, 60 tugs, and 100 barges shuttling supplies from East Coast ports like Baltimore, Washington, and Philadelphia. Just shuttling back and forth continuously. The Grant's Army had everything it needs, and there you can see a picture of one of the boats stocked and the wagons and everything. One of the things that was very important was the railroads to the Union supply lines. And here's a photograph showing supplies being transferred right from rail cars at the front at Petersburg to wagons that would take them further up the line. During the war, the U.S. military railroad operated more than 2,000 miles of railroads that they captured from the Confederacy. So again, he had to have darn good subordinates. And the commander of the U.S. military railroad was a man named General McCallum. He had been a civil engineer and designer of bridges for the Erie Railroad. And he was appointed by Stanton in 1861 to repair and operate the railroads. The U.S. military railroad was part of the Quartermaster department under Meigs, with whom he worked easily throughout the war. There's another picture at City Point, Virginia, the supplies stockpiled for Grant's Army, and a picture of the small engine house and U.S. military facilities at City Point. And in charge of the railroad construction was General Herman Haupt. He was an engineer, and he was professor of engineering at what is now Gettysburg College. But he moved on from that to become chief construction engineer of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And if any of you are from New England, you've probably heard of the Hoosac Tunnel in western Massachusetts. At the time the war started, he was in charge of building that tunnel through the, I guess it's the Berkshires. You probably heard the story of Lincoln visiting one of these bridges early in the war, and he said it looks like it was made out of bean poles. If you've ever seen pictures of it, it looks like this ricketiest thing you ever saw that still managed to hold trains. By the end of the war, they were actually stockpiling pre-built bridge trusses in Alexandria, Virginia, and wherever they were needed, right on the flat car, right to the site. They could repair bridges wrecked by the Confederate cavalry in 24 hours or something.
Wow.
Another genius.
Wow.
So they delivered the goods. There was more than 400 locomotives assigned to the U.S. military railroad during the war, either captured or built by northern locomotive factories. There's another innovation that Meigs came up with in the U.S. military railroad. They had a ferry boat where they could actually take the rail cars in Washington, load them on a ferry, bring them down to Aquia Creek in Virginia, reload them on the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad, and take them right up to the lines.
Was the Union far ahead of the Confederacy in this way?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I did a talk on the Southern Railroads in the Civil War, and they had huge problems with the gauges not matching, being unable to. I think they built one locomotive during the whole war. They couldn't get supplies easily from Europe. So they basically cannibalized their railroads, whereas in the North, they just kept building more and more things. So again, the South had all sorts of problems other than they did have courage and Robert E. Lee. So the other big supply problem was Sherman cut off his supplies in Atlanta. 60,000 troops marched right across Georgia to Savannah by Christmas of 1864. And when his men arrived in Savannah, Meigs had already staged tons and tons of supplies. His army was completely re-equipped, wagons, uniforms, guns, tents, the whole thing, everything they needed. Sherman said, "I am sometimes amazed at the magnitude of the quartermaster's operation." So Meigs and Stanton visited Sherman in January of 65, and they plotted the coming campaign. And later that spring, his army was completely resupplied again at Goldsboro, North Carolina. So another huge accomplishment for Meigs. Meigs was there at Abraham Lincoln's deathbed. There's a lithograph of him with the other, with Mary Lincoln and all the others that were there in the room. He was put in charge of the funeral at the Capitol. And in fact, today, April 19th, 1865, was the funeral at the White House and then a private memorial in the rotunda of the Capitol. Meigs was in charge of setting all of that up. During the war and after it, he created Arlington National Cemetery. He authorized the first burials in June of 1864 in the flower garden next to Robert E. Lee's Arlington House mansion. Even though he worked and liked Lee back in 1837 in St. Louis, he believed Lee to be a traitor, and he wanted to ensure that Arlington House was never going to go back to the Lee family. By May of 1865, there were over 2,600 soldiers buried there, and he eventually established 30 national cemeteries to gather Union bodies from all over different battlefields. Lee's son, George Washington Custis Lee, finally got paid the equivalent of $4.5 million after the Supreme Court ruled that the taking of his property was illegal. This was long after Robert E. Lee had died. There's a picture of Arlington National Cemetery, the soldier graves in 1875, and what it looks like today with former Lee Mansion. I'm sure most of you have been to Arlington, and what a somber spot that is. Meigs stayed in the Army. He built this house in Washington in 1869 on Vermont Avenue. Unfortunately, it's now been torn down, and there's a modern high-rise apartment house there. He remained quartermaster of the U.S. Army until 1882. He disposed of all these war supplies for more than 1 million men and all the ships. They had spent $70 billion during the war on supplies. And there were so many supplies around that 100 years later, you could still buy them. And in fact, I bought my authentic Civil War bayonet in 1961 or something from a military supply catalog house. And they were selling authentic Civil War bayonets 100 years later. A lot of it went over to European armies, but a lot of it stayed here in warehouses. Meigs made several trips to Europe and studied the organization of the armies of Europe. And he wrote a quartermaster manual that remained in use until World War I. While he was still quartermaster, he expanded the aqueduct, and he built the National Museum, which is the Smithsonian's second building. He finally retired and became architect of the new pension office building, which housed 1,500 clerks. By this time, the organization of former Union soldiers called the Grand Army of the Republic had a huge, huge clout in Congress, and they made sure that former soldiers were taken care of and their widows with pensions. So they needed this huge building to house the clerks to process the pension requests. He also became a regent of the Smithsonian. member of the American Philosophical Society and a member of the National Academy of Sciences. There's a picture of the pension building. It was controversial, as you know, most of Washington is neoclassical. He did this in an Italian Renaissance design, and people were quite upset at the time. It's still there today. I think it's a museum of the American Institute of Architects or something like that. But it doesn't look like much on the outside, but inside you can see the reception area there is very nice. Death finally came to the master builder. He died January 2nd, 1892 of pneumonia, and he's laid to rest at his cemetery, Arlington National, with high military honors. And his tombstone reads, soldier, engineer, architect, scientist, patriot. There's a picture of the family plot at Arlington. On the left of the picture there is his son's tomb with a bronze bas-relief. What's his legacy? Well, there's one of them. World War II, ship transport supplies and soldiers. Makes sense. USS General MC Meigs. It served troop transport in World War II in Korea, and it was scrapped in 4 years after running aground in Washington State. Here's another one of his legacies. General Montgomery Meigs, his third time's grandnephew. He served as commander of the U.S. Army in Europe until 2002. And he had 2 more stars than his namesake. And after he retired, he lived and he just died last July. If you wanted to hear more, read more about this extraordinary man, there is a book to read, Quartermaster by Robert Harrod Jr. That's the story of this remarkable man. We may not have won the war without him. Any questions?
Was his rank of Brigadier General, was that a brevet rank or was it a permanent rank?
He was in the U.S. Army, so it was permanent.
Permanent. It was
The
a
brevets were
Yeah.
family volunteers, U.S. Army volunteer regiments. So he was official.
oh he was a
And
regular
right.
Brigadier General,
Yeah,
not a
been in
brevet.
the Army since 1837. And sometime during the war, he got promoted to Major General. I don't remember the exact date. Other questions?
What was his relationship with Lincoln? What was his relationship with Lincoln? Lincoln was supposed to have been very hands-on with people in the.
Lincoln interfered more with the military tactics side of it. He trusted Meigs to provide the supplies. So his interference was basically, telling McClellan that you don't want to use the Army, can I use it? That sort of thing. He worked very well with Lincoln and Lincoln's cabinet. Any others?
What about the Confederates? Did they have a similar position, and how did that work out?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the name of their quartermaster. They had all sorts of problems where people got fired regularly, and the name escapes me. And I had researched it as part of that railroad talk. They fired their quartermaster right about the beginning of 1865. Because things were, as you know, Lee's army was starving to death there in Petersburg, and back in Georgia and the Carolinas, there were 1 million pounds of salt pork they couldn't move from there to the army. So they had all sorts of trouble with their quartermaster. Okay.
I know that when you were researching Camp Elder, you saw some requests for supplies from the doctor. got rejected just because it was the wrong form or copied or something.
Yeah, it wasn't written on both sides of the paper and it was a
Yeah.
duplicate and wasn't supposed to be. You know, I don't,
That sounds atypical in Meigs' organization.
yeah, if you followed the rules to the letter, you didn't get in trouble. In fact, the guy who sent those, didn't send those supplies got promoted. But I really don't remember whether the medical corps was under Meigs or not. I think they have procured their supplies separately.
Is Gentle Dan okay? I don't see him moving at all.
What was the question? It's
Is
just,
Gen- is Gentle Dan okay? I don't see him moving.
He may be taking a rest.
I bored him to death. That's okay.
Okay.
All right, well, thanks for your attention. Hope you got something out of that.
Well, thank you again, Dave, for
Thank you, Dave.
presentation. Before you leave, I remiss at making one earlier announcement, but maybe it's better at the end anyway. So I just want to remind you that next week, Monday, is the speaker that was referred to earlier, John Hurt's memorial service. If anyone is interested in that, it will be at 11 o'clock on Monday, the 25th, in the sanctuary, followed by time of fellowship and luncheon in Spelman Hall. And if you get the church announcements, it's on last Thursday's announcement, I believe it is. Yeah, last Thursday. So Thursday will probably come out again as a reminder. But on last week, Thursday one, there's also a Zoom link because the service will be provided via Zoom for those of you who would prefer to be at home and watch it. And then while he was not always many times an active participant in Tuesday morning, Bob Poole's memorial service is on Thursday at 2 o'clock in the sanctuary. And that will also be you can watch that online, the link in there.
This Thursday?
Next Thursday, let me look. Bob Poole's is the 28th. So next week, Thursday. Both of these are next week events. So, thank you.